Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back. My name is Jessa, and today's video is a really exciting one because it is my wrap-up for the 2024 Our Fantasy Bingo Challenge. If you are not familiar with what the Our Fantasy Bingo Challenge is, it is a bingo board of about 25 squares created by the moderators over at the Fantasy subreddit. They put this together every single year and it runs between April to April. I will be going through the books that I read for each of the prompts. I'll talk a bit about the prompt and also about my thoughts and opinions on the books. The Our Fantasy Bingo has an additional hard mode challenge, and so while I actually did not complete the hard mode, I did try and complete as many as I could just to challenge myself. So the first one was first in a series, and the additional prompt was to read the first in a series that has over 4 books in it. So I decided to read This Woven Kingdom by Tahereh Mafi. So it's like fantasy story following this character who is sort of living in poverty in this kingdom that has a lot of discrimination going on, and she is secretly the lost heir to a Jinn kingdom. The Jinn are persecuted in the society mainly because they have these different forms of magic. Our main character Eliza has to sort of like live in seclusion and in hiding so that she is not found. However, there starts to be some political upheaval going on that ends up disrupting the status quo of her life. Overall, I did enjoy this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I really liked our main character Eliza. However, there is a secondary character that we are following who is the prince of the country that she lives in, and I did not like him at all. There is also a romance that goes on between them, and I wasn't a fan of that mainly because I didn't like him. It's quite long, like it's about 500 pages, and I didn't really feel like a lot happened in it to warrant that length. I think it could have been condensed a little bit, especially in the beginning. I'm still optimistic about this series and would like to continue with it because I did like our main character, and I've heard that there is a second love interest that gets introduced that I'm hoping to like better. The next prompt was an alliterative title, basically 2 words that begin with the same letter. The hard mode was to choose one that had 3 words beginning with the same letter, and I chose for this one The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is the Broken Binding edition, and it was actually the first one that I received from the Broken Binding subscription, and I was really excited about this one because I've heard so much praise. I feel like this is one of the most like beloved epic high fantasy series, so I was really excited about this pick. Overall, I really enjoyed it. It was a really well done and like fast-paced, intriguing fantasy. Maybe not fast-paced, I think maybe some people would dispute that, but I felt like there was a lot of action going on. Even if it wasn't always like physical action, there was still some sort of like driving force behind the plot at all times. It still isn't like one of my all-time favorites, but I'm hoping to maybe like the other ones in the series a bit more. I'm really anticipating the second one in particular because I've heard it has more female characters, and this one, something that I thought was missing in it was representation of female characters because we are mainly following 2 main characters, as well as there is quite a lot of violence against women. Would really like to see some female characters have, you know, more agency and have more positive stories in this world, even though the world on the whole I believe is quite dark. But overall, I did like it and I'm excited to continue with it. The next prompt, something that was either underground or under the sea. The hard prompt for this was to read one that was over 50% under the sea or underground. And so for this one, I chose A Letter to the Luminous Deep. I read this one as an audiobook. It is set under the sea, and we're following this character living in this place called the Deep House that is a house underwater essentially, and basically weird things start to pop up. There's like these ancient ruins and some like weird magic things that are going on. She's seeing this outside of her house and she decides to contact a scholar, and so our main character is like writing letters between her and the scholar. However, we're not only reading those letters, but we are reading them from the perspective of the 2 siblings of these characters who are reading these letters in the aftermath of those 2 characters' deaths. It's quite an interesting one because it is told solely through epistolary format, so through letters. I did find at times, especially because I was listening to the audiobook, that it did get a bit repetitive because each and every single letter would open with like the proper letter address, and I feel like if I was reading it physically, I could have like skimmed over that part because it wasn't like really important, but when you're listening to an audiobook, they're reading every single thing that is on the page. Overall, I did enjoy this one. I felt like it kind of lagged at some parts, and I enjoyed our 2 initial characters reading their her exchanges more than I did reading the exchanges of their siblings, though I did still like that part of the book because it was really interesting to see them like sort of both commentating on the relationship that was forming between their siblings and providing additional background information that helped to understand some of their behaviors. I do hope to continue and read the sequel to it as well because it did kind of end on a bit of a cliffhanger. The next prompt was criminals, and the hard mode prompt for this was to read a book featuring a heist. So for this one, I ended up choosing 5 Broken Blades by Mike Corlin. This one I really enjoyed. I give it a 4.5 star. This is a high fantasy with a romantic subplot that follows these 6 characters forced on this quest to assassinate tyrannical king. And in order to assassinate the king, they actually first have to steal this magical artifact that he wears that grants him immortality. It is inspired by Korean folklore and legend, and I really liked the world building. I thought that well done, but also like integrated into the story well, and also pretty simple. Like there wasn't really like a big complex magic system going on, which I think was beneficial to it because that meant that we got to follow the characters more closely. That was something that I really liked about this book, is that we had such a big ensemble cast, and something that I really liked was that we initially got introduced to our character, the pairings that they would sort of like end up with, like the romance that would develop. Because of that, we actually got to see the romance develop, and so we got to see them both as individuals in their romance, and then later as their group expanded to see how they interacted all together. So I felt like despite having a pretty big cast and not being a very long book, I still felt like we really got to know and understand our characters and their motivations pretty well. So this is also one that is in a series, and I already have the second book, and the third book comes out later this year, so I hope to continue it soon. Also, it has these like really cool sprayed edges. This prompt was dreams. Hard mode prompt was read a book that didn't have like magical dreams. The one that I read I think actually had both magical dreams and both normal dreams, but the normal dreams were sort of influenced by magic, and I'll sort of explain why. And that was The Stars Are Dying by Chloe C. Peñaranda. So this vampire romantasy that is following this human character who was forced to compete in these trials that are held by the vampire king to basically become one of his immortal guards almost, and also their citizens are protected. So we follow our main character Estrella, who is sort of forced into this competition against her will, and on top of that she also has this voice in her head that is speaking to her. It does have dreams, and that's sort of why the dreams are a bit like semi-magical, because she has like dreams and nightmares and stuff like that, and sometimes the voice will like talk to her, not necessarily during the dream, but sometimes like after the dream. And she also sometimes thinks that when she's talking to the voice that it is a dream. So it's a bit like fuzzy on whether or not it was magical dreams or not, because I think there was both. Overall, I did really enjoy this book. The next prompt was entitled Animal, an animal name in the title, and the hard mode prompt for this was to read one that was a magical animal. So the one that I decided to go for this one was The Dragon's Promise by Elizabeth Lim. So this is actually the sequel to The Six Crimson Cranes, which basically follows our main character Shiori, who is the princess of this nation, and she has 6 older brothers who were unexpectedly turned into cranes by their wicked stepmother. It's very like fairy tale inspired. I would say that there is sort of a lot of like Studio Ghibli-esque elements to it as well, so it's very whimsical, and I actually liked this one better than I liked the first one. We get introduced to new places in this world and also some new characters, and I really liked the world building and exploration. That I liked getting to see more elements of this world, especially like the dragons, which is why the book is called The Dragon's Promise, because I really liked this one and overall really enjoyed the series. The next prompt was Bards. So this was basically to read a book where the main character is like a bard or a musician or a poet of some. The hard mode was to read one where the character was explicitly called a bard. This one I kind of struggled with because I did read a book where the main character was explicitly called a bard. However, they were explicitly called a bard because they were playing a D&D character that was a bard. So it wasn't really them, it was a character within a character. So I didn't end up counting that for this prompt. The pick that I ended up going with is not not one that has bards in it, but the main character is a musician, and it is Song of the Six Realms by Judy I. Lin. It's actually one of my favorite books that I read in 2024, and also one of my favorite books for this bingo card. This one we are following a main character named Shui, who is sort of trained as like a courtesan, and she is trained in the art of the zither, which is a traditional Chinese instrument. This one has a lot to do with like music and folklore. A lot of the history and world building is within the songs that she is playing, and so I really liked that element of incorporating elements from traditional Chinese culture through the zither and also these songs. I really liked that inspiration, and I liked how she sort of like seamlessly woven these elements of music into the story, and sort of similar to the Dragon's Promise, I felt like it gave it this very like whimsical feeling. I would say that the fantasy elements in this sort of come in a bit late. I've read some reviews on Goodreads, and a lot of people haven't had the best experience with it as I did, and I think that is more so because the plot line does sort of take a back seat for a while. Like what is said like in the synopsis of the book doesn't really come to pass until about halfway through. That would be like some, I guess, a word of caution about this book, is that it is slow moving, and it is more so about an exploration of the characters and the aesthetics of the world than it is about a central plot line. But overall, I really liked this one and would recommend it. The next prompt was to read a book either with a prologue or an epilogue, and the hard mode prompt was to read one that had both a prologue and epilogue. So most fantasy books do have one or the other, and a lot of them have both, especially if you're reading books that are epic fantasies. However, I actually went with a not epic fantasy for this one, and that was Wisteria by Adeline Grace. This is a sort of like YA gothic fantasy series that centers a romance. This is the third book in that series, so it is the finale to that trilogy. But the first book is called Belladonna, following this character named Signa, who is haunted by the shadow of death. Basically everyone in her life died at a party held at Family Manor when she was a baby, and she was the only person to survive that. And ever since then, she has sort of been haunted by death because she has been passed around to these different guardians, all of whom unexpectedly will die. She also finds that she is unable to, and by doing that, she ends up countering the personification of death, who she ends up sort of having a bit of a romance with later as the series goes on. So it's a really interesting series. It does a really good job at including gothic elements in a fantasy setting, and I also think the lore behind it is really good. There is sort of like some mystery as the plot line, but I do think that it is more of a romance focused series. If you are going to pick it up, known that it is more romance than it is anything else. I think I liked the second book, Foxglove, the best though out of the three, but I still liked this one, but I had some issues with the ending. However, there is a novella called Holly that is coming out that I believe is going to be a bit of like a Christmas novella, so hopefully that one might solve some of the issues that I had with the ending of this one. The next prompt was to read an indie or self-published book. Hard mode was to read one that had less than 100 ratings. So for this one, I ended up reading Legends and Librarians, which is sort of a cozy fantasy set in a like magical library. I thought this book was quite good. It is like rather fast-paced and quick, and I find that most cozy books tend to be quite short. Basically, we're following this main character who is returning to her like childhood home to sort of like revitalize her childhood library that when she arrives there has actually been taken over by these storybook spirits, which are basic entities that are actually personifications of literary characters from books in the library. And so the magic system in this one is all like based around books. They have this like annual book writing festival where it's like writing the books, and the passion that the authors have generates magic. I think is very much like a love letter to book. There is also like a romance plotline with this, as there is other character who is a member of the Adventurers Guild who is helping her out. So overall, I really enjoyed that one, and I would give it a try if you are someone who likes cozy fantasy. The next prompt was a romantasy, and the hard mode prompt for this was to read one with an LGBTQIA+ main character. For this one, I decided to read The Honey Witch, is also a cozy fantasy romance. I personally did not like this one as much much as I liked some of the other books. If you can see, actually, I started tabbing it and stopped like a quarter of the way through because I was like, I'm not enjoying this enough to put in this amount of effort. But we are basically following this character, I believe her name was Marigold, and granddaughter of a witch, and she's growing up in this sort of society that's oppressive towards women. They sort of have expectations that women are just, you know, supposed to get married and have kids, and she doesn't really want that life. Her grandmother, who is the honey witch of this island, basically offers her the chance to take up her place on the island. The only caveat to that is that the honey witch is unable to fall in love because of a curse that has been placed on them. However, as the story progresses, there is a love that emerges between her and one of the other characters named Lottie. And at first they sort of have a bit of a rivalry, and then they slowly start falling in love. I liked the romance between them. I thought built up well, and I liked the sort of dynamic between them. However, it was more of the world building that I was upset about. I didn't feel like the magic system was very well fleshed out. There was also a bunch of like lore behind why the honey witch was cursed that I feel like just wasn't explained very well, and I didn't like some of it. Felt like the characters weren't as fleshed out as they could have been. I still think that this could appeal to a lot of people, and if you're looking for something that is that like cozy, quick, easy to get through romance, then I would say this one might work better for you. Cover is very like cottagecore, cozy, whimsical, so if that is what you like in books, you might like this one more than I did. Even though I like those things in books, which is why I picked it up, but it just didn't have enough depth to really grip me personally. The next prompt was a dark academia book. The hard mode prompt for this was to read one that was not set at like a magic school. However, the book that I ended up reading was one that was set at a magical school, and it was The Black Witch by Lori Forrest. This one, I didn't really know what to expect going into it. Intrigued though by the premise because we are following this character, the granddaughter of super powerful witch called the Black Witch. However, she herself does not have any magic, and she is basically forced by sort of older members of her family who have a lot more social prestige than she does to attend this academy, or else she is going to be forced into a marriage that she does not want. This world is very sexist, and I thought the author handled these political themes really well. There was also a lot of discussion about political discrimination and the violence that is inflicted upon other groups in war times because this nation that she was pressed other group, and I thought that was really well done. A lot of these other groups are also like fantasy races, and so there was a lot of discussion about how her society views these other groups as lesser and how the other groups view her society as very aggressive. I thought this book did a really good job at exploring and describing those themes in detail and in a way that I think was appropriate for the audience that it was written for, because it is a YA book. The caveat that I have to this on why it wasn't like a 5-star read, a lot of the relationships that we saw between the characters in terms of trying to deal with their own sort of prejudiced and bigoted beliefs was through the lens of them developing romances with each other, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when you had like 5 different like romance subplots that were just sort of like popping out of nowhere, it didn't really work for me. It kind of missed the mark on some points, but this is one that I would like to continue with this series, and so I've heard that the romance is actually a lot more in the second book, but I'm still intrigued by the premise of this series. The next prompt was to read a book with a multi POV style narration, and the hard mode prompt for this was to read one with 5+ POVs. And I was really excited by this prompt because my most anticipated release as of April of 2024 was Wind and Truth. And this was like a no-brainer. I was going to read this anyways because I actually binge read the entire Stormlight Archives earlier in the year, and then was like, oh my gosh, I have to wait 7 months for this next book. And that 7 months well awaited. And as you can see, there's a lot of tabs here, which means that I love this book. I know that there are some mixed opinions on this book, and even I myself have some mixed thoughts about some of the plot lines, and I did, as many others are saying, feel like at times this book kind of dragged a little bit and was a bit too long. I don't really know how much I can talk about this series just because this is book 5 in it, and each of the books is over 1,000. So that's a lot of content going on. It's sort of like a hard series to explain in general, but basically we're sort of like set in this world. There had been these people called Radiants who had these powers, and the Order of Radiance is now dead, and in the aftermath there are these different warring kingdoms, and we basically are following these different characters who occupy different social positions within that nation as they are sort of struggling to reconcile both with the present conflict and also its connections to history of the Radiant Order and maybe some aspects of that magic maybe possibly coming back. It has a lot of point of view characters, way more than 5. One of the most expansive fantasy series I think that's currently out, and so I would highly recommend this series to anyone that loves fantasy. I do think that it would be a bit hard to get into it if you were a beginner to the fantasy genre. However, The Way of Kings, which is the first book in the series, is honestly one of the best books that I've ever read. Words of Radiance, which is book 2, I think is actually, if not my favorite book, at least within the top 5 of my favorite books of all time. So I think even though this book kind of lags a bit, like it is so much better than a lot of other books that I've read, and the fact that Brandon Sanderson is able to keep you engaged in these like 1,000+ page stories to the point where I literally have read one of them in 2 days because I was that interested and I needed to know what was going on to the point where I could not put it down. I feel like it's a really solid endorsement for how good this series is. The next one here was published in 2024. So I've read quite a few books that were published in 2024, like obviously Wind and Truth was a 2024. I think the hard mode prompt for this was to read a debut book. I didn't do that, and I think that's because a lot of the debut books that I have in here that were written in 2024, I counted them for other prompts. But the book that I ended up choosing was The Undermining of Twyla and Frank. So I listened to this one as an audiobook, and I also had listened to the first book in this series, which is called The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, on audiobook as well. I think it's a really fun and interesting fantasy romance series that is inspired by classic rom-coms, but it is set in this sort of like fantasy world that is inspired by like the Western frontier in American history. And there's this place called Tanria that is the former grounds of the gods almost, and it's like a land that has now been abandoned. There are these different marshals, so the love interest in the book is a marshal, and then both of our characters in this book both are also marshals, and so they basically go into sort of Tanria wilderness and they have to fight off these things called drudges that are basically reanimated zombies almost. I think it's a really fun and inventive world, and I think this second one takes a more cozy-ish spin to things because Twyla and Frank having to take care of some baby animals. And I'm excited for the third book, The Undercutting of Rosie and Adam, 2 characters that we have been introduced to in this series. So the next prompt was to read a book featuring a character with a disability, and the hard mode prompt for this was to read a book where the main character is the one who has this disability. The book that I ended up choosing for this prompt was God Killer by Hannah Kaner. This one, our main character is called Kissin, and she is a god killer. As the title sort of implies, it's a bit sort of like the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski, how there is order of people hunting monsters. In this world, the monsters are actually gods, and there's a lot sort of variety within like who and what the gods are. In this book in particular, we are following Kissin as she is recruited by this young girl who has this god bound to her soul. That god is the god of white lies, and he is sort of animal kind of thing that follows this girl Inara around. And Kissin is torn on what to do because she has sworn herself to this role of killing gods because in this empire, because of these mass sacrifices that were happening, the king has now outlawed the worship of gods. But there's also a bit more going on behind the scenes with the king as well, because we're introduced to this third character who is a knight and a former friend of the king. So these 3 characters end up sort of meeting up, and they go on this quest trying to free Inara from the god of white lies. And Kissin, who is the main character in this, has a physical disability. I believe that she is missing some of her limbs, has like PTSD issues and trauma because of what happened to her when she was younger, and also just the world in general is pretty dark. And Inara as well, I would say, is also has some maybe mental and traumatic issues as well, because her childhood was also pretty rough and sort of part of why she has bonded with that god. I really like the premise of this book, but I wasn't the biggest fan of the execution of it. It's rather short, but I felt like it was a lot longer, and I feel like that was mainly because the writing style was a bit dry and wasn't the most expansive, I think, for what the world needed. And we're also like following multi POVs between these different characters, and I felt like because of that we didn't really get to see too much of their actual personalities. And even when they began sort of like interacting with each other, I didn't really feel like the relationships were all too convincing of like how much they cared about one another. I do have the second book in the series, which is called Sunbringer, and the third book, Faithbreaker, I believe just came out this year. So I would like to give the second book a try. I think the concepts and the world was really well done, but some of the thematic and character execution wasn't the best. The next prompt was a book that was published in the 1990s, and that was Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. So this is like, I feel like one of the most beloved series of all time. It is the first book in the Farseers trilogy, which is following Fitz, who is orphan boy who is, unbeknownst to him, the bastard son of the heir-to-be of, basically he is brought to the royal palace. His father, who is Prince Chivalry, who is set to become king, abdicates his throne and leaves Fitz to be raised in this court with next to no protection. What ends up happening is that Fitz becomes, as the title sort of indicates, an apprentice to an assassin, and we follow him as he sort of like grows up within this court, being trained as an assassin and also just being a kid in general. Overall, I do think I really enjoyed this book, but I felt sort of similar to some of the other ones that it was a bit slow at times. But I do see why a lot of people, especially people who maybe read this series when they were a lot younger, really connected, because we're following Fitz as he's growing up from, I believe, the age of about 4 years old. Even by the end of this book, he's only preteen age, so can understand why a lot of people really gravitated towards this. I also have the other books in the series, so I would like to continue with it. I wasn't the biggest fan of some aspects in it. The magic system I felt like wasn't the best explained. I still don't think it was like poorly explained by any means. Some of it just didn't really make as much sense. There was also a lot of like violence against animals in this book, which is kind of a weird thing to be nitpicky about. Sometimes it's the little things that sort of bother me, but I did enjoy this one, and I can see why so many people love it, and I hope to continue with this big like Realm of the Elderling series. The next prompt was Orcs, Trolls, and Goblins. So this one was to read a book featuring orcs, trolls, or goblins, and then the hard mode was to read one where the main character was one of these. I ended up reading Forged by Magic by Jenna Wolfhard, cozy romantasy book. I would describe it as cozy. The author herself in the author's note says might not be cozy to some readers because it does have more spicy content, but I don't think it's anything too outrageous. And overall, I really enjoyed this one. We're following this main Daella, who recruited by the emperor of this conquering nation to sense people who have this specific type of dragon magic. She is set on this voyage to go to this island to survey the inhabitants. However, her ship ends up shipwrecked, and she ends up on this other island where she encounters this blacksmith by the name of Rivelin, who is like, I want nothing to do with you, get off my island. Then later is like, oh, but we could actually use this to our advantage, because if we trick her and, you know, make her fall in love with me, then she's not gonna hunt us down. So then the townspeople sort of hatch this like plan to like get her to fall in love with Rivelin, and of course that's what ends up happening. There's sort of competition that they have to work together for. Has some like more serious issues in terms of like both of the characters' past, like how Daella got into that situation where she forced to do these things by the king, like the history of the orcs in this world, and also the history of that dragon magic and why it's being hunted down. I would recommend it if you are someone who likes cozy romantasy and wants something that has a more unique take. The next prompt was to read a space opera book. The bonus prompt was to read one by an author of a marginalized identity group, Gideon the Ninth. This one, and again, is a very popular and sort of a bit polarizing of a series. I feel like it is one where people either love it or hate it, and I happen to be in the latter. I wouldn't go so far as to say hate, but this was definitely one of the lowest rated ones for me. One thing that people say about this book, and they usually say this in a positive way, is that it's very confusing. They're like, this was so confusing, I didn't know what was going on, but I loved every single second of it, and I didn't. I was a bit confused confused, but I feel like what the author was going for was more to purposefully make people confused, but I felt like I was more confused by the author's inability to actually explain things properly. And part of that might have been this aspect of like trying to get into the character's headspace, because I know that the second book in the series, which is called Harrow the Ninth, actually has a second person narration style. So it might have been some aspect of like getting into the psyche of Gideon. Sort of give like a synopsis of this. We're following this character named Gideon, who is a member of the Ninth House, which is one of 9 houses that are part of like this necromancer elite that are sworn to uphold the sort of will of this dead emperor, or it's like the emperor's will. They carry, each of the houses carry out a different part of the emperor's will. The 9th house are the keepers of the locked tomb, and there's some sort of mystery going on. Gideon is sort of recruited by Harrow, who is the heir of the 9th house, and is recruited to be her cavalier, to sort of go with her as she attends this sort of magical academy that is set in. At this school, we meet all these different characters from the different houses, and slowly they start getting picked off one by one, which is a bit of a strange occurrence at a school designed for necromancy. So there is sort of like this murder mystery plot line going on top of like, I don't know, I just didn't feel very compelled by the plot line. I didn't really care about any of these characters dying, and I didn't even care about the characters that weren't dying. I just didn't have any investment in it. I can see elements of why this would appeal to others potentially, because I do think that the magic system and the world building, really interesting premise, it just kind of fell short for me personally. The next one was to read a book by an author of color, and a bonus prompt for it to have been their debut book published within the last 5 years. So for this one, I decided to read The God in the Gumiho by Sophie Kim. So this one is a romance that is set in like a fantasy world. So this one I would say is more romance heavy than it is fantasy heavy. However, our 2 characters are a god and a gumiho. This is inspired by Korean folklore and legend. The author herself is Korean as well. Main female character, Hani, is a gumiho, which is basically a fox spirit in Korean folklore and mythology. They basically eat the livers of the men that they kill to replenish their energy, and Hani is like the legendary scarlet fox, where there was like this incident where she killed a bunch of men. The other character is a god. His name is Soka, a trickster figure within Korean folklore. So he is like exiled from the heavenly realm and is basically sent to the human world to basically hunt down the monsters that he freed. Hani, after finding out that Sokja is hunting her, decides to sort of team up with him, throw him off the scent of her trail. It's a really interesting exploration of gods interacting with our own modern present day world, and also of these 2 characters' identities, and also 2 characters who are sort of like villainous characters trying to find different pathways towards redemption as bigger evils start presenting themselves in this world. The second book for this series, The God in the Guishon, is coming out later this year. I'm very excited for that one because this one ended on a pretty big cliffhanger, so I'm really excited to see where it ends up. The next prompt was survival, and the bonus prompt for this was to read a survival book that doesn't have any sort of virus or pandemic situation. I decided to go with The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent, following this main character named Araya, who is the adopted human daughter of the Vampire King, who decides to participate in this competition held in honor of Nyaxia, the death goddess. Whoever wins this will gain some sort of favor from her. Araya basically decides to go in hopes of sort of like proving herself and escaping from her father's shadow. Unexpectedly, she ends up encountering this man named Rain, who is also like a vampire fighting in this competition. And there's these different like houses, the House of Blood, the House of Shadow, and the House of Night. So they each have like different powers. There is some conflict between the different houses, and Rain happens to be part of one of these different houses. So there's a really like interesting push and pull dynamic as these characters are both sort of forced to team up while they're also slowly getting to know each other better and starting to develop feelings for one another on the backdrop of these huge political events happening. So I really like this one. Once again, there is a sequel to this one called The Ashes of the Starcursed King. I have not read it yet, but I hope to be able to read it soon. The next prompt was to read a book set in a small town, and the hard mode prompt for this was to read one where the small town itself was totally mundane. actually read The Whispering Night by Susan Dennard, which is the third book in the Luminary series. I would like explain the Luminary series as being Teen Wolf if it was about monster hunters instead of about wolves. Like, it very much has that feel of like the 2010s shows. So like Vampire Diaries, Teen Wolf. There's a little bit of supernatural in there. It's very like nostalgic. In the first book, the Luminaries were following this character named Winnie Wednesday, which is a bit of a silly name, but each of the families is named after days of the week, which is on like go out and patrol. But Winnie, her father was accused of being a Diana, which is basically a witch. Her mother and her brother were sort of like exiled from the Luminaries on the whole. Winnie is very determined to reintegrate into the Luminary society because there really isn't much other choices for people in this small town. She's sort of grown up on the fringes of society, seeing her family be mistreated by everyone around her, and she's really determined to like prove that she is not a traitor like her father and start involving herself more in the Luminary society. She also starts to uncover a lot of secrets behind it. Because this was the third book, you can probably tell that I enjoyed the series. I feel like because it was a YA, there were some elements where it was plot line and the developments of it were self-evident. That was a point that really, I think, docks points off of my enjoyment factor of it. But once again, it is written for a younger audience, and I think it is one that is appropriate for a younger audience. The next prompt was to judge a book by its cover. The hard mode prompt for this was just to not read anything else about this book, and I had the perfect book for this because in April, which was actually when I started my Fairy Loot subscription, because once you get the invite, you don't really get to choose whether or not you like that book. I was like, okay, I'll just use that as this book, and that was Darker by 4 by June C. L. Town. I didn't really know what to expect going into it. I'm gonna just show off the edition because it is really beautiful and is one that I actually unexpectedly found myself really liking. I would sort of classify it as being Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunters, but if it was with Chinese folklore and mythology. And basically we are following this character named Rui, who is a exorcist in training at this elite school. She goes out on patrol and runs into this guy, and something ends up happening where her powers end up transferring to him, and he is the scion of this important family who has no magic. And then all of a sudden he's given these powers that he's never had before, while Rui, who is someone who is of a lower social standing than him but is someone who has a lot of power, is suddenly left without any. These two characters are forced to like team up with one another to figure out what's going on. This bigger mystery about different like gods of death. I think one of them has gone missing and it has thrown the world off balance, which is why there's been a lot more of these supernatural events happening. Rui is tasked with finding this lost god. There's a lot of really interesting elements at play. This is one that I recommend and was quite surprised by how much I did like it. And once again, this edition is really pretty. So the next prompt was 5 short stories. This was another one that I struggled with, and it was actually the last prompt that I did. I, in general, am not too big of a short story reader. Tales of the Celestial Kingdom by Su Lin Tan. So this is set in the Celestial Kingdom world inspired by Chinese folktale and legends, and she writes like interconnected stories all set within this world. This one is like a companion to the Celestial Kingdom duology, which is Daughter of the Moon Goddess and Heart of the Sun Warrior. I read Heart of the Sun Warrior earlier this year. It was the last one that I read. I literally finished it last night, like only a few minutes before midnight so that I could count it. Basically just sort of fills in some of the gaps between the Celestial Kingdom duology. So there's like one story that takes place for the events of that duology, and then there are a few that take place in the midst of that duology following other characters, and then there is also sort of like a bonus, almost like epilogue chapter. Overall, I think I enjoyed it. I don't really feel like I can read this the same as a novel because they are connected to one another, but they're sort of still separate narratives in of itself, so there are ones that I enjoyed more. I am excited to read more from her, and I actually hope that she gives maybe writing with an ensemble cast a try, because obviously she had things that she wanted to explore happening in other characters' perspectives, and I think that maybe writing a book with an ensemble cast point of view could be a good way of doing that. The next prompt was Eldritch Creatures. The hard mode prompt for this was something that is not connected to the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos. I'm not really someone who reads like horror books in general, so I was like, no, thanks, and also there's problematic aspects of H.P. Lovecraft's legacy. I did find out, however, that elves and fae count as eldritch creatures, so for this prompt I decided to read Faebound by Sarah Al-Arif. I read this one as an audiobook, and initially when I started it, I actually wasn't vibing with it. I think there's a lot of really interesting elements in this series because we have both fae and elves who are basically following these two characters who are elves. There's like some war going on between different kingdoms. Our main character is Yiren, and she is like fighting in this war, and she ends up getting dismissed from the army, and she gets exiled. Really know what to do. And then her younger sister decides to follow her into exile, as well as her second in command officer. And then they all of a sudden end up stumbling upon fae after one of them accidentally kills one of them. The magic system in this one is really cool. However, it is one that I would sort of caution people about because similar to the Assassin's Apprentice, there is a lot of animal sacrifice in this one because the way that the magic works is harvesting it from the animal. And there is some sort of discussion in this between some of the characters about the ethics of this system. I do think it is still quite interesting to explore that, especially because a lot of historical cultures also use animal sacrifices as elements of their belief system. I thought that the world building was really good here. That I think was the strongest aspect because I didn't like the characters very much, and I didn't really like the romantic relationships that developed either. I just didn't really feel like there was a lot of depth to the characters. Some of the choices that the characters were making were just, in my opinion, a bit stupid, and I thought the romances that were going on were kind of developing at a pace that was a bit too fast to be realistic. And I also wasn't expecting it to be as much romance as it was. I still think it's more fantasy with a romance subplot because there is more of larger plot going on. I just wasn't 100% keen on some of the choices that Sarah Al-Arifi decided to go with. Next prompt, read a book that has reference materials, and the hard mode for this one was to read a book that has at least 2 reference materials. I think they sort of defined reference materials as really anything that is referenced within the book outside of like the actual written text. Decided to go with Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. This is another one that I've only read recently. It's one that I really enjoyed. It has a lot, I guess, references to texts that exist within this world, like songs and poetry, but mainly there are, for each chapter, there's like references from this particular book that one of our characters is reading and is sort of highly influential on their religious and social beliefs because they come from this particular group. Those belief systems are highly based around Hebrew and Jewish folklore, and I think that was really well done. Cassandra Clare herself is Jewish, and I really liked her exploration and inclusion of, you know, that identity within a fantasy world. And I think the way that she went about exploring it was also formed by the historical period that this book in general based off of, because the kingdom that we're set in, which is called Castellane, is sort of like, I would say, inspired by Spain and Italy, which were some of the first countries to introduce persecutory measures against Jews, in particular the ghetto system. And so there is sort of a system similar that sort of informs a lot of that character and how she operates in the society. Her name is Lynn. She is sort of training to be a like medicinal scholar, sort of like a healer, which is largely closed off to women. So she experiences a lot of discrimination even within her society that she is already like being discriminated against. She has a lot of the odds stacked against her. And then our second character that we're following is Kel, who is actually one of the characters that is on cover, and he is basically a body double or sword catcher for the prince, who is Connor. And Kel was basically like an orphan who was like taken from the orphanage that he was living with to basically pretend to be Connor. Political things going on in the background and also at the forefront that Kel and Connor are dealing with, and that Lynn also, as she gets to know them, ends up being sort of embroiled in as well. Overall, I really liked this one, and I thought its uses of reference materials was really well done. Now we are at our last one. The prompt for this one was a book club read-along from the Art Fantasy subreddit, and that is The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst. The hard mode prompt was to participate in the readathon and discussion of it. However, I had actually read this book before. It is another like sort of cozy fantasy. It also has a romance subplot, but I would say that it is more focused on the character as opposed to the romance. Basically, we are following this character named Keela, who is like librarian who's working at a high establishment library in the capital city. A revolution happens in the city and they start burning down the library, so she's like, oh my gosh, I need to save the books. So she packs up all the books that she can onto this little dinky boat and ends up like sailing away back to the island that she grew up on in hopes of saving these books and also not dying in the flames of a revolution. She basically arrives at her old home and is sort of forced to like revitalize it in a way, and in doing so forced to grapple with some of the grief that she experiences because her have passed away, and she's sort of been trying to run away from her old home to not have to deal with those emotions. And then she also encounters Laurent, who is the romance interest in this, and he sort of like helps her out with setting up her little shop, which she ends up setting up in the house, sort of jam business that she's used as a means to cover up the spell shops that she's actually running. She's like making like different potions and stuff like that to try and help the island. And so Laurent is sort of helping her, getting all these things set up. There's going to be a sort of follow-up. It's called The Enchanted Greenhouse that's coming out, I believe maybe in June. So I'm very excited to pick that one up. That was 25 books, and I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed listening to me talk about these books, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about any of these books if you have read them or if you would like to read them. I'd also love to know if you did the Our Fantasy Bingo Challenge for this year or if you are going to be participating in it next year. I hope to have another video coming out soon where I am going to go over both some recommendations and also that are on my radar to be the picks that I end up reading for those prompts. Thank you so much for just watching this video, being on my channel in general. It's really nice. So thank you and goodbye.